talk about her, tell you the truth. But every time you say something about her, I see that kid come to the wire.
That was the kid that she cut up.
Yes. She was a very bad woman.
Just a whisper of her name sent shivers down the spines of many American soldiers. They called her Apache, a name that evoked a sense of fear and danger. And it was easy to see why. Tales of this terrifying woman floated in the ears of the American soldiers who fought in the Vietnam War. Not because they'd seen her, but because they'd heard what she was capable of. She was feared not just for the number of men she killed, but for how she allegedly broke them before they died. Till this day, no one truly knows who she was or how she came to be. There are no photos, no confirmed records, and no gravesite. However, some veterans swear she existed, with one sergeant even claiming he tracked her down and ended her life. How true is this? Who was the most terrifying woman of the Vietnam War? And why was she so feared? Let's find out. Background context. There's nothing as motivating as a good, scary story to jolt a group of hungry, tired soldiers to fight till the end. But what happens when that story straddles the line between reality and fiction? Such was the case with Apache, a rumored female Viet Cong officer known for torturing prisoners in brutal, methodical ways. Her name was synonymous with danger. And according to the many U.S. Marines who believed in her existence, Apache's victims weren't simply executed. They were used to send a message. She was rumored to take her time. She'd maim a soldier slowly, sometimes over hours, sometimes days. She would and even use She did all these within earshot of their comrades, forcing them to listen. Then, when her message was clear, she'd let the prisoner die. In a war already filled with trauma, jungle ambushes, and guerrilla warfare, her story became something else entirely: psychological terror. Much of what we know, or think we know, about Apache comes from the account of Carlos Hathcock, a legendary American sniper with 93 confirmed. He claimed to have been the one who eventually tracked her down and shot her. And while the validity of his claims is to be questioned, he's really the only noteworthy source we've got. According to his version of events, her death wasn't another mission to him. It was personal. He said, "We were after a woman sniper who tortured and maimed a lot of Marines and left them to die. We were going to get her." Carlos's account cemented Apache as a permanent figure in Vietnam War lore. But it also raised a difficult question. Was Apache real? Was Apache real? Since we're on the topic of the Vietnam War, it's only right that we dive deeper to the beginning of it all. Perhaps the pages of history would offer a nuanced perspective into Apache's existence. Widely regarded as one of the most devastating and controversial conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War was fought between 1955 and 1975. The deadly conflict pitted North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, China, and Communist allies, against South Vietnam, backed primarily by the United States and other anti-communist allies. It had initially begun as a civil conflict, but it eventually escalated into a brutal proxy war that cost over 3 million lives, both military and civilian. To American soldiers arriving in Vietnam, the terrain was disorienting. The thick jungles, unfamiliar climate, and indistinguishable civilian populations made the war unlike anything they had been trained for. But what truly haunted many wasn't just the combat. It was the invisible enemy. The Viet Cong, a South Vietnamese communist-led guerrilla force, didn't wear uniforms. didn't fight in open fields, and didn't retreat according to Western rules of war. They moved through tunnels, disappeared into the forest, and struck when least expected. They were so skilled that even the U.S. military, with its superior weapons and air power, found itself repeatedly outmaneuvered by an enemy that blended seamlessly into its surroundings. But what made the Viet Cong even more unpredictable was their use of psychological warfare. And within that arsenal, figures like Apache emerged. Unlike conventional armies of the time, the Viet Cong integrated women into nearly every aspect of their struggle. Vietnamese women were not relegated to the sidelines. They fought as soldiers, acted as informants, transported weapons, and served as medics. Some joined combat units directly, while others worked in underground resistance cells. In fact, women made up as much as 40% of the Viet Cong's forces. This was new to many of the American troops. Why so? Well, at the time, women in America were still widely viewed through the traditional lens of femininity. So it didn't exactly make sense that a woman who was supposed to be mellow and docile would be dangerous, or even more dangerous than a man. This unexpected reality added a layer of psychological tension to the battlefield. A female torturer? That wasn't just a military threat. She was a representation that felt fundamentally unnatural, the complete reversal of every expectation a soldier had about women. If women could play such a huge role in a war like this, what else did the Vietnamese have up their sleeves? Nothing could have prepared these soldiers for the brutal reality of Apache. According to the tales, she wasn't simply a sniper or a soldier, she was someone who used torture as a tool of fear. She deliberately targeted the minds and morale of American troops, breaking them until they had nothing else to give. Then, she would leave them to their ultimate fate, death. But there was something about Apache. She felt a little abstract, almost like you could feel her presence. You could see the works of her hands, but you never really saw the woman herself. Allegedly, she was a commander in charge of interrogation and punishment, choosing her methods not just for pain, but for the psychological scars they left behind. Some said she was a trained sniper, others disagreed. Instead, they claimed she was a field commander who enjoyed inflicting pain. No one ever really knew the full truth about her, and this inconsistency is one of the many reasons her story seems so hard to verify. But one thing was clear. Fact or fiction, the psychological warfare practiced by the Viet Cong worked. Morale among U.S. troops suffered, in part due to the fear of capture, torture, and mutilation. It didn't help that many American troops were barely out of high school, fighting a war they didn't fully understand, in a country they'd never heard of until they arrived. Faced with an invisible enemy, horrific booby traps, and sudden ambushes, they clung to stories of heroes like sniper Carlos Hathcock, and stories of monsters like Apache. But Apache wasn't the only woman to terrify American soldiers, so why did she become the most infamous? Who was Apache? One thing that probably made Apache oh so dreadful wasn't her methods of torture, but most likely the mystery she was shrouded in. Think of it like a ghost story coming to life. On the one hand, you're not sure if what you're seeing or hearing is real. On the other hand, however, the fear it sparks is very real, and that fear spreads. You hear whispers from fellow soldiers about a woman who doesn't just kill, but enjoys inflicting pain. You catch half-told stories of men found mutilated, their screams echoing in the jungle days before they were discovered. No one knows exactly where she is or when she'll strike next, but somehow, everyone feels like she's close. That's the terrifying thing about legends. They don't need to be confirmed to feel true. They live in the silences between gunfire, in the rustle of the trees at night, in the shadows that never quite settle. In Apache's case, the mystery was the weapon. The ambiguity of her existence turned her into something larger than a person. She became a presence, a force. And in a war where the lines between civilian and soldier, right and wrong, victory and survival were constantly blurred, that kind of myth was more powerful than any bullet. And to make matters worse, those who saw her never lived to tell the tale. It's why we've got only word of mouth, most famously that of Marine sniper Carlos Hathcock, to go by. According to him, Apache wasn't just another enemy soldier. She was something darker, something unforgettable. So, who was she? Where did she come from? No one knows who her parents were or where she came from, but she was allegedly born on the 1st of January, 1936. Unsurprisingly, there are no official Vietnamese records or confirmed photographs identifying Apache. It's another reason she's so intriguing. A female sniper whose records have been scrubbed clean. That's the thing of legends and myths. Her existence is built almost entirely on the stories told by U.S. servicemen, and these accounts describe her as a Viet Cong commander who specialized in torture and psychological intimidation. She allegedly operated in the Quang Nam province, a hotbed of guerrilla activity in South Vietnam, where she led small units and served as a field interrogator. Apache was said to capture U.S. and South Vietnamese soldiers alive, but it wasn't to extract information in a conventional sense, but to inflict psychological terror on enemy forces. According to legend, her preferred tools were pliers, wires, and blunt objects. The stories claim that she would beat prisoners, cut them slowly, tear out fingernails, and even castrate them, all while forcing nearby American troops to listen to their comrades scream. Her goal, allegedly, wasn't just to punish, but to break morale. It's why she didn't kill immediately. Instead, she dragged the process out so it would haunt survivors and demoralize nearby units. According to these stories, Apache knew the power of fear. She used pain as a performance. The most well-known account of Apache's death and of her existence comes from Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, one of the most lethal snipers in the U.S. Marine Corps history. With 93 confirmed kills, Sergeant Carlos was already a legend, but his story about Apache is among the most repeated and controversial of his career. According to him, he and his spotter heard reports from Marines about a female VC commander torturing American prisoners within earshot of their camps. The stories were horrifying. One soldier allegedly died from blood loss after having his eyelids cut off and his genitals mutilated. When Carlos learned about her, he claimed it became personal. "We were after a woman sniper," he said in an interview. "She tortured and maimed a lot of Marines and left them to die. We were going to get her." He and his team then moved on to tracking Apache for several days through the jungle, learning her movements, habits, and location. Eventually, Carlos took the shot. He said he caught her walking with a group of Viet Cong fighters, but only she was in his scope. "It was quick," he said. "She dropped like a sack of rocks." To him, it wasn't just another mission. It was an act of vengeance on behalf of the tortured Marines. So, if this was the man who not only saw her and lived to tell the tale, but also ended her brutal reign, perhaps he could give a bit more insight into her appearance. Apache's appearance and behavior. Interestingly, one of the more disturbing elements of Apache's legend is how soldiers described her. She was said to be beautiful or attractive, a description that was almost always paired with comments about her cruelty. Her femininity, in these accounts, was not diminished by her violence, but intensified it. It made her scarier. In the eyes of many American troops, Apache wasn't simply a brutal killer. Just as we mentioned earlier, she represented a complete inversion of gender norms, someone who looked like the women they'd left behind, but acted like a monster. This combination made her particularly terrifying because not only was she an enemy soldier, she was an idea, a distortion and proof that even beauty could be deadly. Although some military psychologists have speculated that the story of Apache may have been exaggerated or even invented as a way to cope with the horror of guerrilla warfare. And it's not hard to see why they think so. Facing an enemy that refused to fight conventionally, that used women and children as soldiers, and that fought with unseen methods created a kind of mental pressure cooker. In that setting, a story like Apache's was almost inevitable. But whether or not she was real, her story was powerful. She embodied everything American soldiers were trained not to expect. A woman who was not a victim, not a civilian, but a calculated. If she existed, she was a brilliant user of fear. If she didn't, then her myth still accomplished the same thing, instilling dread. Fear is one of the oldest weapons in warfare, and the Viet Cong understood that deeply. By spreading stories like Apache's, whether grounded in fact or fiction, they disrupted the psychological stability of American troops. When soldiers feared capture more than death, when they saw every villager as a potential spy, morale collapsed. That's where Apache operated best, at the edge of truth, deep in the mind. And when news of her passing finally spread, none were happier than the American soldiers who were forced to deal with the psychological trauma of her existence. Apache's Death. When Sergeant Carlos awoke on the morning of November 13, 1966, there was only one thing on his mind: ending Apache's reign. He wasn't sure how easy or tedious the entire process was going to be. However, he knew one thing for sure: Apache wasn't going to see the next morning. For all the fear she reportedly spread through U.S. ranks, Apache's death was rather anticlimactic and lacked the sensation one would expect from such a turn in events. According to Sergeant Carlos, the man who ultimately gunned down the ruthless woman, his mission to kill Apache wasn't assigned through a formal military directive. It was personal. And it wasn't hard to see why it meant so much to him. His fellow soldiers were losing morale because of this woman. If no one did something about her, the war would be lost long before it even began. Who wouldn't take it upon themselves to take out such a terror? At the time, Sergeant Carlos didn't know so much about her. He had heard from fellow Marines about a female Viet Cong commander who captured and tortured American soldiers, leaving their mutilated bodies behind as psychological warfare. Carlos claimed that her actions weren't just cruel. They were strategic, designed to crush confidence and ignite fear in anyone who heard the victim's screams. It was then that he and his spotter, John Burke, decided to hunt her down. After days of tracking her in the dense jungle near Hill 55, not far from Da Nang, they located her unit. Apache was reportedly walking with several Viet Cong fighters, unknowing that two of America's deadliest snipers were watching. "I had her in the scope," Hathcock recounted in interviews. "She was talking to a group, and I watched her for a while. When he had a clear shot, he pulled the trigger." Apache fell instantly. Although there is no official confirmation of her identity or role from the Vietnamese side, and her body was never publicly identified, Carlos still maintains that the woman he killed that day was the same figure who had haunted their units for weeks, if not months. To them, there was no doubt it was Apache. But here's where things get a little more interesting and quite confusing. Carlos was sure beyond a reasonable doubt that the woman he had shot was the Terror. However, some things just don't add up. First of all, for someone as terrifying and storied as Apache, her death, as told, does feel rather flat. And while we know reality isn't as sensationalized as fiction, and that this story claims to be rooted in reality, it's just a little strange. A single sniper shot from a distance, ending a reign of terror, that had allegedly haunted entire units? Were things ever that simple? Well, this stark simplicity is likely because the story of Apache is based on one main source: Carlos himself. And his account, while compelling, is brief and maybe lacking in specifics. So, what could we be missing? For starters, there's no name, no records, and nobody. Not even the Vietnamese acknowledge her existence. It's almost like someone created a terror out of thin air. To make matters even more confusing, the woman Carlos killed was never positively identified. For all we know, she could have been a regular Viet Cong soldier, or even a courier who Carlos believed was Apache. This raises a huge question. Was she really Apache, or was the myth of her death constructed after the kill? Secondly, Apache was feared because of how personal her violence was. She allegedly tortured prisoners up close, screaming, blood, agony. But in contrast, her death came from a distance. Carlos never spoke to her, never even confirmed her name. It wasn't a dramatic showdown. There was no capture, no conversation, no final moment of reckoning, just one bullet. Then, there was also no confirmation that the woman Hathcock shot was carrying torture instruments or leading an interrogation team. She was reportedly walking with a few VC fighters, but there were no signs that she was mid-operation or that she held any rank. If Apache truly was a high-ranking psychological warfare expert, wouldn't there be evidence, documents, a radio, or gear? Finally, it's a little too convenient that everything we know about Apache's death comes from Carlos's own retelling, and, secondarily, his spotter, John. There's no official combat report titled Operation Apache. No squad testimony. This absence of a broader narrative might suggest that even within the military, her death was more rumor than record. In short, there's a high chance that Apache's entire story, including her death, is a legend shaped by war trauma, memory distortion, and myth-making. In guerrilla warfare, where enemies blend into villages and disappear into jungles, soldiers often gave names and narratives to faceless threats. Apache may have become the embodiment of all female Viet Cong fighters, rolled into one brutal figure. In fact, historian Andrew Wiest, in Vietnam, A View from the Front Lines, notes that stories like Apache's were part of the mental survival kits soldiers built to make sense of chaos. But one thing's for sure, whether or not Apache was real, her death had a huge impact on the soldiers. Impact on morale. Despite the uncertainty surrounding Apache's identity, her death became a symbolic victory for the Marines. Reports suggest that news of her demise lifted morale across nearby units. Soldiers reportedly cheered, some even celebrating it as retribution for fallen comrades who had been tortured or killed. In an environment where victory was hard to measure, where hills were taken and lost repeatedly, and where guerrilla warfare blurred every line, Apache's death felt like a rare, clear win. Not only had a feared enemy been taken out, but she was killed by one of the most legendary sharpshooters the U.S. had. For Carlos, however, the moment wasn't a triumph. It was grim satisfaction. She was evil, he said. She had to go. Her death, like her life, remains shrouded in the haze of memory, hearsay, and myth. But here's another certainty. Whether Apache was entirely real or part symbolic, her story struck a deep nerve in the psychology of the Vietnam War. Now, here's where things get kind of uncomfortable and really interesting. The way Apache's story has been told over the years, especially in books like Marine Sniper by Charles Henderson, has raised a few eyebrows. A scholar named Ugo Fracassa took a closer look at that version of the story, and he saw something most people don't really talk about. He noticed that the way Apache is described feels, well, weirdly sexualized. There's this strange mix of fear and fascination. Charles's book doesn't just focus on her being a ruthless torturer. It also mentions how she looked, how she moved. There's even a part where Carlos and his spotter are said to be watching her while she's urinating. That's not a war detail. That's something else. And Fracassa makes a strong point. Instead of just being remembered as a dangerous enemy, Apache is kind of turned into this fantasy villain. Someone who's both terrifying and strangely seductive. It's like the narrative can't decide if she's a monster or a femme fatale. Or maybe it wants her to be both. But here's the twist. Fracassa believes this whole legend might actually be a reversed projection. During the Vietnam War, there were plenty of real documented cases of U.S. soldiers committing sexual violence against Vietnamese women. A brutal and shameful part of history that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. So what if the Apache story, with all its violent sexual imagery, is really a way to flip that reality? Instead of American soldiers being the perpetrators, the Apache myth turns the tables. Suddenly, it's a Vietnamese woman doing unspeakable things to American men. She becomes a kind of monster version of guilt, something that justifies hatred, masks shame, and wraps it all up in a legend of victory. It's dark, but it's also a reminder of how war stories aren't always just about what happened. Sometimes they're about what people need to believe happened. Which brings us to the final part of this video. Gender, fear, and power. There are countless stories of brutality in the Vietnam War, on both sides. But the story of Apache lingers differently. Why? Because she wasn't just brutal. She was a woman. To understand the fear Apache supposedly evoked, you have to first understand what she subverted. Expectation. In most societies, especially in the 1960s, women were seen as caregivers, nurturers, symbols of life, not death. The idea of a woman torturing, maiming, and psychologically tormenting grown men shattered an entire generation's perception of femininity. American soldiers were trained to fight men, to outgun them, to survive them. But Apache, if she existed, was different. She fought with fear, humiliation, and pain. Her goal wasn't just to harm, but to dominate. And doing so while being described as attractive or feminine only deepened the horror. This made her not just an enemy, but also a contradiction. There's something primal about that fear. Society has always had room for male monsters, warlords, dictators, and executioners. But when a woman takes up that space, the reaction isn't just fear. It's confusing, disbelief, and, very often, obsession. In Apache, many saw a kind of vengeance, a woman not surviving war but weaponizing it. Torture, in her hands, became a language of power. She represented the darkness that war brings out in everyone, regardless of gender. And that's perhaps what terrified soldiers the most. She wasn't an anomaly. She was a signal that no one, man or woman, could escape what war turns people into. Whether she was a symbol of feminine rage, a specter of psychological warfare, or simply a rumor designed to terrify, Apache shattered the boundaries of how women were supposed to behave in conflict. She didn't simply exist in war, she rewrote the emotional battlefield. In doing so, she became something more than human. She became a story, a warning, and a myth passed from foxhole to foxhole, wrapped in equal parts truth and terror. Despite the fog of war surrounding her story, Apache has never really disappeared. She remains a frequent topic of debate in online military forums, oral histories, books, and documentaries. Some people recount her as a confirmed war criminal. Others doubt she ever existed. But all agree she left a mark. Her story is often included in retrospectives about Carlos Hathcock, where her legend gets revived and re-examined. Sometimes she's remembered with awe, sometimes with rage, but rarely with indifference. Like many wartime legends, Apache refuses to stay buried. So why do some stories stick and others vanish? After all, many other women terrorized the Americans during the war. Let's just say Apache's survival in the public imagination speaks to the power of myth-making in war. Myths help people understand the unthinkable. They allow soldiers to embody fear in a single face, and they give chaos a shape. Apache's story is a case study in how memory, rumor, and trauma intertwine. The gruesome details told by Marines may have been real, perhaps committed by multiple people across different times, but Apache became the face of all of them, a human form given to faceless pain. She's also emblematic of how women in war are often remembered differently. Female combatants have often been erased from traditional military history, or worse, only remembered when their actions violate expectations. Apache's legacy is shaped not just by what she allegedly did, but by who she was while doing it. She's still discussed today, not because we know her story, but because we don't. It's that uncertainty. Was she real? How much is true? That keeps her legend alive. In the end, Apache has become less of a person and more of a lens. Through her, we examine the lines between justice and vengeance, fear and fact, woman and warrior. Finally, in the long, dark ledger of Vietnam War history, Apache's name stands out. Not because we can confirm who she was, but because we can't. Her existence lives in a kind of purgatory between truth and legend, soldier and specter. To American Marines, especially those who served near Da Nang, she was very real. Real enough to whisper about at night. Real enough to fear more than bullets. And real enough to cheer for when Carlos said he put her down. To historians, she's a mystery. To others, a cautionary tale of how trauma and storytelling can blur the lines between myth and memory. But whether Apache was a woman of flesh and blood, or a symbol constructed from war's worst imaginings, her impact is undeniable. She left behind no confirmed photographs, no grave, and no name in official records. Yet her legend outlived many who served beside her and feared her. They feared her more than they feared death. That line, spoken by soldiers who thought they knew her, says more than any record ever could. Real or not, Apache became what war always leaves behind. Unanswered questions, unfinished stories, and shadows that never quite fade. What about you? Do you think Apache was real? Or was she the result of myths and legends? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. To enjoy more exciting videos, click play on the video on your screen. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notified when a new video drops.